Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Ream Library. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors an array of lectures, conferences, discussions, conversations that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. We also sponsor an initiative on Jewish-Christian relations and one that enhances our understanding of Catholicism as from a global perspective. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Daniel Hungerman, an economist from the University of Notre Dame, for this year's Phi Beta Kappa lecture. Not only does today's talk help us to think about the impact that regular people can have on big issues like climate change, it helps highlight one of the many ways that economists, including my friends and colleagues in the economics department, use their discipline to try to solve a wide range of socially pressing problems. Today's talk actually builds on a paper that our speaker co-authored with Holy Cross's own Vivek Murthy, who is an assistant professor of economics. The paper is titled, "Every Day is Earth Day, Evidence of Long-Term Impact on Environmental Activism," so you can see the connections. It was published in the American Economic Journal in 2023. And today I'm grateful for a chance to work with the Department of Economics and Accounting, especially Professor Melissa Boyle, our chair, who has helped with the coordinating the Phi Beta Kappa speaker. Dan Hungerman, as I mentioned, is professor of economics at Notre Dame and also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's former executive director of the Association for the Study of Religion, Economics, and Culture, a former member of the executive committee of the Association of Christian Economists, and is president of the Association for the Study of Generosity in Economics. He also enjoys teaching at Notre Dame and has been recognized by the university for promoting excellence in undergraduate instruction, and I'm sure that today we'll see why. So please join me in welcoming Dan Hungerman.
Good afternoon, how are we doing? Good. Thank you guys so much for being here, and thank you to Phi Beta Kappa for having me, and I especially want to thank the faculty here for welcoming me today, taking me around campus. It's been a lot of fun, especially once the weather got a little nicer, seeing the campus and interacting with everybody. So thanks. You might think that you're going to learn a lot about Earth Day today, and hopefully you will learn some things about Earth Day, but I hope you're actually going to learn about more than just Earth Day today. I hope you're going to learn about the importance of taking action and doing little things in your community to make a difference in your community. The truth is, I didn't do this work, I didn't get started on research on Earth Day because I cared particularly about the environment. So I mean, I like the environment as much as the next person, right? But I wouldn't have said, honestly, before I wrote this paper that I like the environment more than the next person. So this is a paper that actually, maybe more than any work I've ever done, the work I'm going to tell you about today changed my thinking, and has, in ways I'll explain later, changed some of the actions I take in my day-to-day life. So if I didn't get into this work because I believe so strongly in the environment or anything like that, how did I get started in it? It was because of work on volunteerism, contributing time and money and generosity. So a lot of my career has focused on looking at underappreciated parts of the nonprofit sector and trying to demonstrate how and why they matter to society. So that started with work on like faith-based charities and religious finances, so kind of like the economics of of congregations and things like that. I think it's a pretty important part of American society, one that is still underappreciated today. Then, more recently I've done work on wealthy donors, like super wealthy donors. Now you might be thinking, oh, there's no way they're underappreciated. Everybody knows how important they are. I actually think they might be even important than most people realize, but that's like a different talk for a different day. So today, what I'm going to talk about is voluntary actions, especially taken by like what I'm going to call young people. So that's like college students, high school students, stuff like that. This is an area of work where certainly across different disciplines in academia, scholars have done research, but it's understudied and we don't know a whole lot, both about the causes of voluntary action and about the consequences. So let me start with the causes. This is a map from a survey on volunteering that has information on how often people report volunteering all across the United States. And what I did was I broke this map into different chunks. The very light colored ones are the states where people report the highest levels of volunteering. Utah is number 1. Then you got the like yellowy gold color, that's the second highest group. So here we are in Massachusetts, my home state of Indiana right there. The brown states, and then the bottom one are the gray states. So I've looked at a lot of maps like this in my career of all different sorts of social phenomenon. And this one's kind of interesting. I mean, at first blush, it's like, sure, Utah's number 1. I can make sense of that. That's no problem there. But the longer you look at this map, it's kind of strange. So like, for instance, all these southern states are hanging out together. Well, that's no surprise. They often do that in pictures like this. Not, whatever. Not that I'm saying anything. But meanwhile, over there with them, you got California. Rarely in maps like this are the southern states and California hanging out together, right? And I don't actually have a great explanation for that. So I don't think anybody else does. So even as a basic first pass at a map like this, the causes of voluntary action, not real well understood. The causes, similarly. So here the story is even maybe a little more pessimistic. So economists have studied voluntary actions before. And one of the biggest mysteries they have is why anybody bothers to do it. This is because economists, they think about it in the way economists maybe sometimes do. So they look at the voluntary actions people take, they try to measure the social benefit of it, and they square that against the cost. For the economics students in the class, they might use the notion of opportunity cost, the cost of someone's time, for comparing, the costs and benefits of volunteering. It turns out the benefits from voluntary activity are often pretty low. In fact, they're often lower than the measured costs, and so you have a bunch of supposedly smart economists sitting around wondering why people bother to volunteer, right? So there's actually an open question in economics why people, including like super high wage people whose value of time is really high, bother to volunteer as much as they do. When it comes to environmental volunteering, it's even worse. It's even harder to measure benefit. For some voluntary activities, like say packaging care packages for hurricane victims in Florida and North Carolina, it'd be pretty easy to kind of measure output. You can just count the care packages. Or if you went to a protest to try to get somebody out of jail, you can say, well, did they get out of jail, So you can kind of quantify the benefits pretty well. But when you do a protest to support the environment, it's kind of hard to figure out how to even measure it. So we've got this challenge that we wonder why people bother to volunteer. And when it comes to environmental volunteering, it's kind of hard to measure benefits to come up with evidence to bring to bear on this challenge. And so as a result, perhaps, you have a lot of different players in society, especially for environmental volunteerism, wondering about whether it's valuable. So this is a quotation from Greta Thunberg. You might know who she is. I was about to say she's a teenager, but I think she's 21 years old now. So anyway, she's a young adult who has done a lot of work organizing strikes and protests related to climate change and other environmental issues. And here she says, there's this argument in Sweden, that's where she's from, and everywhere else it doesn't matter what we do because we're all too small to make a difference. You have similar sentiments across society. So starting with policymakers, in 2018 there was a big protest in Australia done by school children on climate strike. Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, said it was a waste of time, that the kids' time was better spent in class, that school was for learning, not for protesting. The next year there's a climate strike in the United Kingdom, again done by school children. Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Theresa May, she comes out and says this is a waste of time. This issue best addressed by Parliament, not by school kids. Coming to this as an outsider, again, somebody who didn't really care about the environment, particularly interested in volunteerism, I was really struck reading work by the United Nations or by think tanks and such. Tons and tons of the conversation about the environment focuses on big policies, things like carbon taxes and stuff like that. Yeah, those things are really, really important, but discussion of the regular actions of regular people on a day-to-day basis, not seen anywhere near as much. And then regular people themselves seem to question the value of this sort of volunteering. So there are surveys, and there have been actually for decades, where regular individuals are asked, do you, take actions to protect the environment, recycling or, whatever. And when people say, no, I don't, they're asked why. And you can imagine a couple different answers. I mean, one would be that you didn't believe there was a real problem. So you might say, oh, this environmental concern stuff, it's fake news, I'm not worried about it. But that's not what people say. Instead, when you ask people why they don't do more, they say, because I don't think my actions matter. So, do they matter? With that in mind, today what we're going to talk about is Earth Day. I'm going to tell you some about Earth Day, and in particular, we're going to talk about the very first Earth Day, which happened in 1970. We're going to look at evidence on its legacy that's a little different from other evidence that people have brought to bear on this issue or any sort of voluntary work at all. And honestly, the results were kind of different from what I expected when I started, as we'll see. So first, let me tell you a little bit about the original Earth Day. The original Earth Day was conceived of by a U.S. senator from Wisconsin named Gaylord Nelson, who had a strong interest in environmental issues. His goal in creating this day was to change the national conversation about environmental topics. April 22nd, 1970 was chosen as the day with college students in mind. So this day was chosen to be after spring break for most colleges, but before finals week. They put the day on a Wednesday because they knew students would be too busy studying on the weekends to have time to do lots of voluntary activities, okay? And they thought that the weather might be nice. They tried to make sure that there was no other competing event that was big for April 22nd. After they picked April 22nd, they found out that Vladimir Lenin's birthday was also April 22nd. So this is during the Cold War. Vladimir Lenin, mucho not good, okay? So they took some heat for that, and they thought about changing the date actually, and then they said, you know what, forget it. We're rolling with that. It was intended as a one-time event that's absolutely worth keeping in mind for the rest of what I'm going to show you tonight. So today we think about Earth Day as something we celebrate every year, every spring. But that was not true for this first Earth Day. It was one and done. The next time there was a large organized attempt to celebrate Earth Day was 20 years later in 1990. So the results I'm going to show you later about this day, it really came from just this one day. In 1971, there's like a tiny bit of stuff that happened in 71, but like by 72, wasn't being celebrated anywhere. So this was viewed as a one-time event when it happened. But it was a big event. 20 to 25 million people participated. In other words, about 10% of people in this country. It was the largest mass event in the history of the world when it happened. 1970 was a different world than today in some ways also. It's worth noting. Maybe a world that had different environmental challenges and different environmental needs. I was born in Akron, Ohio. That's in northeast Ohio. It's kind of near Cleveland. In northeast Ohio, you have a major river flowing through it, which would be the Cuyahoga River. In 1969, the year before Earth Day, that river caught on fire. So this is a picture of that river on fire. So if you look way in the right edge of the picture here, you can kind of see the far shore of the river there. You guys see what I'm talking about? So then when you kind of go closer here, what that makes clear, the contrast is this isn't the far shore of the river burning, it's the river on fire itself. So they believe that the river caught on fire because of a flare that was shot off of a train that was passing by. And the level of pollution in the river was so high that the river started to burn as a result. The Cuyahoga River was not the first river to catch on fire in 1969. So several other rivers in the United States also caught on fire that year. And it was not the first time the Cuyahoga River had caught on fire. It had caught on fire several times actually, including about 20 years before at night. So this is from almost exactly 20 years before when it was on fire. In fact, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire in 1969 was not even the biggest environmental disaster that week. The biggest environmental disaster that week was an oil spill in Santa Barbara. That was what actually grabbed the headlines back in '69. Although I think most people today would, if you asked them to name a disaster, maybe that one, but the Cuyahoga River burning, probably the first thing that comes to mind. Although being from Northeast Ohio, I don't know, maybe I'm just biased. Not the most objective observer there. But, it's important to note that in a bunch of important ways, environmental awareness and environmental needs then, they were somewhat different from today. So let me tell you then about this Earth Day that occurred in these circumstances. First, it was to some extent bipartisan. So Gaylord Nelson was a Democrat, but he had plenty of Republican friends. He asked them to participate in Earth Day, and plenty of them said yes. So this was not really a day that was meant to be about partisan politics. I do think it's important to emphasize, and I'll say this again later, this was a disorganized event. Earth Day was not brought to you by Pepsi, okay? Nelson had a staff at the Senate, and they actually hired a couple people to help, and they worked out of like a small office in Washington, D.C. And if you were interested in doing something for Earth Day, okay, this is back obviously before the internet and such, so you could call them on the phone, or you could put like a letter in the mail and mail it off, in which case they might take like a one-page flyer that was like, here's some things you could do, and they'd mail it back to you. But that was about it. By and large, people just made it up. They were just doing their own thing. In fact, I even think this is worth emphasizing a little. Like when we think about big environmental players then and today, the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, they did nothing. So they were not important. They are not part of this story. This was a disorganized event where, by and large, students just made it up. Actually, before I jump there, so on the student thing, so 2,000 colleges and 10,000 high schools participated. So schools, super important. Again, they knew that was going to be a main driver, and it really was. This is stupid, perhaps. Again, not being an environmental person, when I read like the speeches and stuff from that first Earth Day, I was actually struck by how intelligent they were. I was like, oh, this is actually kind of smart. Like these people weren't dummies. So, probably says more about me than about them, but I'll get back to that soon. And yeah, there was a lot of activities that they did. So, as an example, to give you an example, kind of what this first Earth Day looked like, we're going to consider the case of Albion, Michigan. Is anybody here from Michigan? Has anybody here been to Albion, Michigan? It's still around. Okay, just curious. So it's a small town of 14,000. It's the home of Albion College. At the time, it called itself Manufacturing Town, USA. And they did a bunch of things on Earth Day. So here are 3 pictures from Albion, Michigan in 1970. This first picture is a river cleaning. So the Kalamazoo River flows through Albion, Michigan, and in the morning of Earth Day, students got together to clean up a part of the Kalamazoo River. This is one of the students at Albion College. His name is Walt Pomeroy. We'll talk more about him later. Here he's interviewing like a local news station. After they did some river cleaning stuff in the morning, the students of Albion had a can smashing event in the middle of their campus. So they brought together all different sorts of cans and smashed them. Today we think of most cans as like beverages and stuff as like being aluminum. But that wasn't really true back then. There was all different types of cans. Aluminum then is probably the most easily recyclable, but there was not like any curbside recycling or anything like that. So after they smashed all these cans, they separated them. They put the aluminum cans in one truck, and then they put the other cans in a different truck. The aluminum cans, they drove to a facility to be recycled. The other ones, they drove to the nearest can manufacturing factory, if you will, and they dumped them in the parking lot to encourage them to, think more about reusable materials. And then they had a meeting with town officials. And then, meanwhile, down the street, like the local elementary school, they had like a go pick up litter outside sort of event. So those, for the results I'm going to show you, those are the sorts of basic actions that we're thinking about. What's interesting about those actions is that they're just local. They're just cleaning up your neighborhood, right? A lot of the discussion of Earth Day certainly today is like very global, big picture, climate change or whatever. And even a lot of the discussion about this original Earth Day focuses on like federal legislation, things like the Clean Water Act, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which actually is probably not super related to Earth Day, the Endangered Species Act, stuff like that, right? But the picture I'm giving you here in Albion, maybe it's just a little different. It's just cleaning up your local community. So it makes you wonder, like, is that part of the legacy of Earth Day? Scholarship is not really big on this idea. So here's two quotations from two different papers. One says Earth Day gradually faded from public attention, that people kind of forgot about it. The other one said it rapidly faded from public view. So there is scholarly debate on how fast it went away, okay? We're wondering if it didn't go away at all. Maybe it just stuck around, right? That was the thinking here. And these studies don't have very much data on this. So the idea here, to go beyond Albion and go beyond the suppositions of past work and see maybe if there is a lasting story for Earth Day. So to put this to the test, I teamed up with Holy Cross professor Vivek Murthy, who is sitting right over here, who I first met before this photo was taken when he was just a humble student at the University of Notre Dame. So here's your before, here's your after. I mean, it's kind of a good metaphor for what we got going on in Notre Dame. This is pretty good. I mean, there's nothing wrong here. But yeah, this is the stuff right here, right? So we got it going. So, looking good there. Obviously, I'm just kind of poking fun of Vivek. I figure in fairness, I should probably do the same to myself. So keep your eyes peeled later in this talk. I'll put up a somewhat embarrassing old photo of myself here. This is the sharpest picture of myself I got. I can't match Vivek, that picture of his. But I can come close, maybe. So if you keep your eyes peeled, I'll show you a silly old picture of myself in a little bit. So in putting Earth Day to the test, we have like a central challenge in terms of methodology. If I was studying, probably some of you have taken, certainly like economics classes, maybe you've heard this sort of story before. But if I wanted to find out the effect of, say, a certain medicine on how healthy a person was, I would do a randomized control trial. I would randomly select a group of people and give them the medicine and then see what happened. In a perfect world, we'd do the same with Earth Day. We'd find a bunch of communities that randomly got Earth Day treatment, and we'd compare them to some communities that didn't. Of course, that's not how Earth Day went down. It was a voluntary event that people decided to participate in. That means if you compare towns that were big on Earth Day to other towns, well, you could run into trouble. Those towns might differ from each other for many reasons. Take two examples, Gary, Indiana, and Boulder, Colorado. Gary, Indiana is a town located between my hometown of South Bend and Chicago. It's a steel mill town. It's pretty gritty. It's had some tough times. At one point, it was the murder capital of the world. It was not very big on Earth Day. The celebration of Earth Day in Gary was very limited. Meanwhile, Boulder, Colorado, La Jolla would be another town. These towns had big Earth Day celebrations. Obviously, it would be completely incorrect to compare the subsequent trajectories of Gary and Boulder and say it was all driven by Earth Day. So if we can't simply compare these towns, what can we do and how can we find evidence of lasting change? The plan that Vivek and I used was to look at weather. In particular, we'd look at unusually good or unusually bad weather on Earth Day to try to mimic a sort of natural experiment. The idea is that the better is the weather, the more people are going to participate in Earth Day. Today, here in Worcester, we got a great, real-world teacher of how important the weather can be if you compare this morning versus this afternoon, right? So when the weather changes, when it gets better, people are much more likely to go outside and participate. So better weather, more participation on Earth Day. With that in mind, we're not going to try to compare Gary and Boulder intuitively. And of course, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details. They're available upon request, though. But we're going to try to compare like Gary's that had unusually good weather to Gary's that had unusually bad weather. And Boulder, Colorado's that had unusually good weather to Boulder, Colorado's that had unusually bad weather. And in so doing, approach this in a way that's kind of like a true randomized control trial. For the older people in the room, when I do this part, I kind of feel like I'm doing the weather on TV. which used to be a thing for the younger people in the room. Let me just explain. You used to get the weather by watching television, not by looking at your phone. But anyways, here's a good weather map. Because, I'm about to use the weather a lot, so I figure I should show you what the weather on Earth Day looked like. So this is the weather on Earth Day. These very black, like little sprinkled places here, the darkest black, those are actually counties we don't have. So those are counties that didn't have a weather station back then. But then that aside, the darker gray areas, heavier rain, and then the lightest areas, no rain. So there's actually quite a bit of variety, fortunately for us, in the weather. Like if you look on the west coast here, you get like scattered showers, kind of like a checkerboard sort of thing, where there's like different variation in the weather. We got this swath of rain that kind of cuts across the plain states. Maine is struggling, but in New England, there's some variety. And in fact, even if you stare at the map for a while, like Tennessee and Kentucky or over here in Arkansas, you can see that almost every state got some rain, actually, and it kind of seems to vary a bunch. All right, for this next part, I will have to, I went back and forth on whether to show these pictures because I think they're really great. Hopefully you'll agree. But I'm going to have to kind of use a bit of language about statistics here. But I think it's worth it because these pictures are pretty great. Here's what I'm going to do to show you the effect of Earth Day in the long run. Vivek and I took data on rain in different days, April 1970. So here's April 17th. This will be for the 18th, all the way up through April 28th, 1970. And then we saw how that was correlated with environmental attitudes 10 to 20 years later. So there were surveys done like in the 1980s where people are asked, how much do you support the environment? Or actually, the way we're going to make these pictures here, it's how much do you oppose environmental spending? Okay? And we wanted to see whether opposition to environmental spending for someone answering a survey in like 1984 was related to how much rain happened in their community in April of 1970. So the picture's going to be full of these little, box and whiskers, is that what this is called? Little pictures like this. You've taken a statistics class, maybe you've seen something like this. There's going to be an X. That's like our estimate of what the relationship is. But as with any estimate, we're not completely sure what the true relationship is. So then we got this, what's called what does that mean? We got this confidence interval here. We're pretty sure the true estimate comes from somewhere inside this dashed line range. And what I'm going to do is calculate this relationship for every day in April of 1970. And I'm going to show you how rain in April of 1970 is related to environmental attitudes 10 to 20 years later. You with me? Here's what you get. So basically, there's no relationship for most days. So that the little x's, they're basically 0. 0 is the horizontal line. And the confidence interval almost always includes 0. So it's pretty likely that the true effect is 0. That makes perfect sense. If I ask somebody in 1984 what their opposition to the environment is, it intuitively should be completely unrelated to how much it rained some random day 14 years before. But for Earth Day, we see a clear effect. What this shows is that if it was rainy in your town on April 22nd, 1970, you are more likely 10 or 20 years later to say that you oppose environmental spending. We only find this effect for individuals who are under age 20 on the original Earth Day. It fades out with age. The older you get, the less affected by Earth Day you were. It really was young adults who took in that Earth Day message. Perhaps against my better judgment, I'm gonna try to explain the size of this effect by way of like an analogy. We know that the older people get, the less they support the environment. It's often a cause especially driven by young people's attitudes, okay? If you got a little more rain on the original Earth Day, people in your town, they oppose the environment a little bit more. How much more? It's the increase in opposition here, it's similar to everyone in your town aging by 1 year. So it's not like super enormous, but it's not completely trivial. It can be put into plain English. The next thing we wanted to do was look at pollution, because that gets at that central challenge of the benefit of volunteerism, which is that it's hard to measure the quality of an environment. there was one pollutant that we could find data on that we thought was sensible to try to test, and that was carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is an odorless gas, invisible, very bad for your health. It's created when you burn things, and it can often be pretty local. So if you burn lots of stuff in your community is going to have higher levels of carbon monoxide. In contrast, like ozone is something where the amount of ozone in your atmosphere could be from thousands of miles away. Okay. So mainly for data reasons, because it's the best thing we had data on, we tried carbon monoxide. What do we find? The level of carbon monoxide in your community in the 1970s and 80s is really only related to rainfall on one day, April 22nd, 1970. The rainier it was on Earth Day in your town, the more air pollution, specifically carbon monoxide, you have in your town 10 to 20 years later. The next picture I'm going to show you, this is like the last picture we show when we present our main results in our paper, but it's the first picture we made. It's on congenital abnormalities. A congenital abnormality is a health event that affects a newborn infant. So like a heart murmur would be an example, but there are often others that are much more serious. Scholars who study the environment often look at the health of newborns to learn about the impacts of the environment, because we know where newborns have been living more or less for their lives, so to speak, right? And because they can be very affected by adverse environmental events. So here's congenital abnormalities. Now, interestingly, this data, because of the way the federal government releases it, it isn't even available before like 1982. So this starts in 82. And then we stop it in 89, both because Earth Day comes back then, and also because the federal government changed birth certificate data in that year. So this is like data from the 80s, right? So what this picture shows is that if you were a mom who gave birth to a baby in the 1980s, the likelihood that baby had a congenital abnormality is related to how rainy it was on the original Earth Day. If it was rainier on April 22nd, 1970, a baby born in the 1980s is somewhat more likely to have a congenital abnormality, a birth defect. How big is this effect? It's kind of like the other two. Not trivial, not super big. By way of analogy, if your town got like an average amount of rain, what you'd call standard deviation of rain, you're more likely to have a congenital abnormality in a birth in the 80s. The increase is about a tenth of the effect of living within a mile of a landfill. So that's like a way to put into words how big this effect is. So it's not like super massive, but it's not zero. Okay, another picture or two. Here we take the effect of Earth Day on carbon monoxide, and we look at it year by year throughout the 70s and 80s. And again, this is mainly the pollutant we have the best data on. That's why we focus on it. I start the picture in 73. Earth Day was 1970. The confidence intervals, these dashed lines, they're so big the first couple years that we just don't even put them in the picture. They screw the whole thing up. They're huge. But these are plenty big. There's no significant effect of Earth Day on pollution here. It starts in 75, suddenly you get a significant effect, and then that significant effect holds out for a really long time. We were kind of surprised when we saw this picture. Then we thought about it some and we said, all right, this kind of makes sense. The idea that it takes a little while to see the impact of Earth Day on pollution, there are a few reasons for that. First, there are what an economist would call frictions, things that prevent or slow people down from immediately doing stuff that has an impact on the environment. For instance, there was huge variation in how much cars polluted in the early 1970s. Enormous. A lot bigger than today, certainly. But people don't buy cars every day. So it might take you a little while before you buy a car. The impact of Earth Day was the biggest on students and kids. Well, it might take a little while before they're old enough to buy a car and drive. And so on and so forth. You might also wonder about mobility, like people moving between towns and stuff over time. We talk about it in the paper. There might be a little bit of a story there, but it's not a key thing. But this delay that you see, it's really important for the story, and I think it's a really important takeaway. First, getting back to this mystery of why people volunteer, This suggests that research has been getting that wrong because it's been looking in the wrong place. If I were to look at an effective Earth Day 1 year later, there'd be nothing. In fact, if I were to look in the first 5 years, there'd be nothing. You got to go about 20 years out to get this story. So if you're volunteering, you're winning the long game. Obvious to volunteers, if not to PhD economists. Okay, did Earth Day matter? Yes. And right, the story here, it's a local one, it's about your community, and it's a long-lasting one. These effects, the ones on birth health, they appear to be slightly larger for low socioeconomic status moms. There's a lot of work about how problems in the environment can hit the least advantaged the most. So here, improvements to the environment benefit the least advantaged the most. These results, they don't include any nationwide benefits from creating the Endangered Species Act and stuff like that. So the overall effect of Earth Day is even bigger than what I'm showing you. We're just focusing on the local story. And like I said, you know, it'd be impossible to see some of this unless you waited for years. And again, just to emphasize, it's a totally disorganized event. People just did whatever they wanted. Can we return to Albion maybe and see a little bit of the picture of how and why Earth Day mattered? Yeah. So after that river was cleaned, Albion built a new park on the river. It's still there. Walt Pomeroy, remember that guy who was interviewing the people in that photograph? After Earth Day, he got really involved in the environment. He became a regional vice president of the National Audubon Society in his career. And then after Earth Day happened, Albion created a recycling center, and they also supported statewide changes in Michigan banning phosphates in the water. So first you have local government undertaking infrastructure investments. That's going to last. Then you change the people themselves in ways that potentially last. And then lastly, you have policy. As an outsider coming to the environmental movement, again, a lot of what I read starts here, and it ignores these two. And again, as somebody coming late to this conversation, I think a lot of the discussion here is kind of bad, actually. So I think this is a problem in the environmental movement, actually. So, okay, small things matter. That's the story here. You know, and yeah, again, you know, feel obligated to roll your eyes for a minute, but yeah, give me 30 seconds. As an outsider to the environmental movement coming late to it, I'm struck by how obsessed with climate change it is. Climate change, very important, no doubt. There are plenty of other ways that we could greatly improve environmental action and policy in communities that are aside from that. So we don't want to completely lose sight of that as well. You know, I mentioned how sophisticated some of the conversation on the original Earth Day was. It's true. Maybe one of the most interesting and provocative things was that a lot of the organizers in different towns, a lot of the people gave speeches. You know, they said, listen, the easy sell is to tell people to do something fun and cool and that it's good for the environment. And that's great. Like, we want to get people in the door that way. But what we really need are for people to understand that they're going to have to make some sort of costly action sometimes to prevent harm. That's a much harder sell. People don't want to hear that. So let's have a discussion about how we're going to get that message across. And reading that, I was like, yeah, that's a good point. It is a harder sell. But people, you know, over 50 years ago when Earth Day happened, they were on that. Reading about all this, I learned, some of you probably already know all this, you know, among basic actions people do today that are harmful, eating red meat, really bad for the environment, actually. Straws, which are kind of silly. You drink a straw, you use it for like 5 seconds, and it goes in a landfill for 100,000 years. It's pretty wild. You know, those would be examples of having done all this work. I was like, all right, I'm going to try to use fewer straws. I'm going to try to eat less red meat. But honestly, I didn't write this paper ever figuring I'd be standing in front of a room full of people saying anything like that. Have I used a straw in the past week? Yes. I've been on the road, and at least once I was at an airport, and I was like, ooh, I'm going to go give this Earth Day talk. This is bad, man. This is not good, right? But I've been trying. But I actually think that sort of story, it's also one we need more of in environmental conversations. So a lot of my work before this, right, on faith traditions, those are voluntary organizations that have lasted for thousands of years. And they've been very effective at getting people to undertake costly changes in behavior that last throughout their lives. How do they do it? Well, they emphasize social bonds and connections in their organizations. I don't see much of that in the environmental movement. They emphasize metaphors that are about journeys, right? Again, don't see a lot of that when it comes to personal action here. And their understanding of imperfect. They set an impossibly high standard for behavior, but nonetheless, almost paradoxically, are also welcoming and okay with imperfection. They say, do the best you can. To economists, I might say, they sometimes emphasize thinking on the margin. Let's take one more step to do better. I mentioned other activism at the start. Doing this work on Earth Days made me think about other things. This event, very famous, known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It's in 1963. Got the Million Man March, the Million Woman March, protests related to George Floyd. Recently, I'll tell you about one more example of work on voluntarism. This is from a student of mine, Tim Spild, looking for a job, who did similar work on a national school walkout. So in March of 2018, I even wonder if there's anybody here who participated in this. Nationwide, there was a huge walkout to protest school shootings and school violence. This is in protest to a school shooting that had happened in Florida. So, Tim, he got data on these protests. He got data on local gun ordinances, towns passing laws about guns. He uses a similar weather approach, and he shows that these protests mattered. The larger was the protest, the more likely your town would pass an ordinance on firearms in the next year. So changes like this, they matter for Earth Day, and maybe they matter for the future. The variation in weather that drives the estimates that Professor Morthy and I use, it's not huge. It's think hundreds of people, a couple hundred people showing up at an event. That's the size of variation that drives the estimates I just showed you. So you don't need 10,000 likes on social media. You don't need an event that 50,000 people show up to. It can be much, much smaller. We need more work on volunteerism for sure. And yeah, if you take anything away from this talk, what I would suggest to you is that you celebrate Earth Day, even if the weather stinks this April, or maybe especially if the weather stinks. Thanks.